All right, thank you very much. So I'm Jason Potts, Ellie Rennie over there. What we're going to talk about is the same sort of topic, but just come at it from a different perspective. And I want to come at it from the perspective not of well, what is the technology and platform we're going to build, but what is the underlying sort of economics and sociology behind the logic of what the opportunity space here is. And I want to look at this from the perspective of answering the question, what actually are journals? What are publishers? How does technological change affect them in the sense that we've had journals for a very, very long time. We've had science and scholarly activity for a very long time. That's been co-determinant with publishing and then recently the internet and so on. And now we've got blockchain and new technology that comes in. And I want to try and give an answer to the question, what is the implication on journals, publishing, and the way in which technology works in this space at a very broad level. And the argument I'm going to make is that I think we've been, or at least the economists have been thinking of what journals are wrong. We've basically misdiagnosed them in a kind of interesting way that opens up the answer to the question, what does blockchain bring into the space in a way that the internet doesn't. So this work we actually published a few years back, and we came up with a lot of this idea and thinking, looking at open access publishing and just what was really going on with why was everyone so excited, but why did it seem to be failing? And published this kind of before we got super interested in blockchain. So we've tagged on a conclusion around the blockchain implications here, but the argument I'm really going to be making is really just to explore the underlying logic of this. All right, so the basic story goes like this. The economics of scholarly and scientific journals comes down to a make or buy decision. Right? And the basic economics of this is just Adam Smith. It's just specialization and division of labor. Why do publishers exist? Because they're good at it, and you're not. And to the extent to which they've specialized and got specialized skills and specialized capital and printing presses or whatever else that they need, that's the reason publishers exist. It's just basic economics. You use a market transaction to do it. Now, why that's interesting is that we think of knowledge as a public good. But here we've got a private solution to the provision of that public good. And that's more or less the tension that we're trying to resolve here. That means, well, okay, so now these private publishers have a lot of market power, and what should we do? Do we regulate them? Do we nationalize them? What? But the underlying economics is quite straightforward in that sense. It's a market transaction. So that's all fine, and that has been true more or less since the beginning of not just scholarly publishing, but journalism and books and so on. Just printing presses are expensive. The skill in putting them together is significant, and writers and authors and scientists don't have those skills to the same extent. Off we go. All right, and then along come computers. Computers and the internet, two separate lines of technology, but what they did fundamentally was change that underlying specialization and division of labor by moving the capabilities more towards the producer end or the writer end or the journalist end or the scholarly end, thus upsetting that, thus giving rise to the open access movement, going, all right, the fundamental economics have changed, therefore the fundamental economic organization should also change as well. That led to a great deal of excitement that sort of started to gather pace around the late 1990s. By the early 2000s, you couldn't shake a stick at media economists who weren't going, look, the economics of this is clear. We should be seeing a transition to open access publishing. So that was a very sort of clear economic prediction. Now, problem was, didn't really work out to quite the same extent as was predicted, to be a very clear shift. And I want to look at what the underlying assumptions were. So the basic assumptions that were going on there was that you had a basic division of labor. Scholars and scientists and so on make knowledge, and journals communicate knowledge, right? So internet and computers are awesome technology because they're a communications technology, right? So of course we shift into that space. I want to suggest that assumption is flawed, and fundamentally flawed in a way that has always been flawed, and it's in a very particularly interesting way going forward. So we had some implications of that around the costs got pushed back onto academics and scholars, and there's a bit of reaction to that along the lines of, well, it's not as easy as we think. There's still skills involved and so on. But the argument I want to make here is it's not the cost of desktop publishing and so on that was the issue. It was the underlying specialization assumption, and the new theory that we'd sort of developed around this was that this was never a public goods, private goods discussion in the first place. That was the wrong way of thinking about it. What was really going on, as had been going on right from the beginning, was that scholarly production and dissemination of information wasn't like journalism, where you have a journalist writing for a reading public or broadcast for viewers. The whole thing was the viewers, the reading public, were other scholars. It was a club model. The output of production was fed back into the input of production. It was never a broadcast model in the first place. And what journals are doing is engaged in this group formation process of creating a mechanism to facilitate that production process, not a dissemination process. So when the internet came along, and everyone was like, wow, that's an amazing dissemination tool that will revolutionize everything. That was a misdiagnosis. It's true, but it missed the fundamental point that the nature of what scholarly journals are doing is that they're part of a production process. Now, from an economic perspective, that means they're clubs. Right? The underlying economic diagnosis of this is not private good, public good, it's club good. A club good is like a common pool, a commons as well, is a similar object. But essentially, it means you have a non-rivalrous but excludable good up to a point of congestion. That's the economic definition of a club good, and a common pool resource is the other way around. But what it means is that the underlying economics of this is a jointly produced, shared group-produced resource where members of the club benefit from other members being in there. And these are reviewers, readers, other people that you're working with, whose ideas you're using. You care who they are. This is not an anonymous club. It's important to know who they are because the reputation effects carry within that. What a club is doing and what a journal is doing, and just as a scientific association in a university department and all these other institutional mechanisms are doing, is providing governance for that joint production process, right? Not just communication tools, right? So there's rules, there's benefits. So, the argument we sort of made here was that the correct economic model of this was club theory. In economics, what a club technically is a set of rules that enable members to confer externalities, benefits on each other. Now that has a few important implications, because clubs, the difference between clubs and, say, markets is markets get better when they get bigger, clubs don't, because they run into congestion points. Clubs have optimal sizes beyond which they fail. Clubs are sort of more difficult to make in that sense. Clubs also don't necessarily require pricing mechanisms because the underlying allocation mechanisms work with inside. They have these specific properties that you voluntarily join them. They experience crowding, but it matters who else is in them. They form partitions and boundaries in a space. This defines research areas. The underlying shared good that a club produces is, in this case, not communication of results. It's not communication. It's a mutual production. It's mutual attention to an idea that is being developed. And this process of individual papers and so on are part of that process. But the club good is mutual attention to an idea, which is why journals form around fields or problem spaces, not the idea of a universal journal of science is just a terrible idea, or when that is, what you're describing there is journalism, not a scientific journal. Nature is becoming a communications technology, not a scientific field in that sense. All right, so this then predicts that we should expect to see that journals will succeed when they behave like clubs, and in this sense. So a lot of these details are in the paper. So we sort of looked at differential success of different journals, and you can clearly see these optimal sizes, that they start to fail when they get beyond a certain size, and also on the other side of that. And a lot of that is to do with sort of congestion problems, and the thing about being in a very large club is that you're not going to get much access to publication in that. So there's a certain minimum, maximum size to these types of things. All right, so that's the sort of broad logic of thinking about clubs as journals as clubs, and clubs as joint, where producers and consumers are the same people, not separate. All right, so what does this mean? What this means then is that when blockchain technology comes along, and it is essentially an institutional governance tool that is very good at just keeping track of members, identity, who did what when, yada, yada, yada. It's the infrastructure we've been looking for, not internet per se, as a, if only we could have a very low-cost dissemination tool. So the logic of sort of revolution, of a sort of a revolution where we rebuild journals using blockchain technology makes, from the economic perspective, makes sense, right? This is what we should have been doing all along. We've been waiting for this technology, and we've had to use other production technologies such as fields, such as departments, such as conferences and so on, to fill in for that missing ability to organize a group of people into a joint production process, and then have an inferior technology which was largely about communication. All right, so this addresses the question of what we should, or what blockchain technology will be used for in an effective building of a scholarly journal, where what we're recognizing here is that what it is doing is not just communicating. What it is doing is building and coordinating and governing a field. That's what it does when it is working well. And when we're spinning one up, that's the thing we need to have in mind, is that that's what we're building, a group, a self-functioning group that confers externalities upon each other. So there's a bunch of different things it'll need to do. We've sort of looked at some of the challenges around what publishers actually do, the extent to which these things can be coded into software and put on desktops and so on. But what we're describing here, again, is not what the author will do, it's what the group will need to build and the infrastructure that group will need to build. The business model of this starts to look pretty interesting, because once we sort of see it like that, once we see that that's what we're describing what is effectively a firm that is a mutual appreciation society that enables people to publish. The question is, what is the underlying business model of that? And this now, we can sort of start to see that what you're doing is you're not funding individual journal articles, you're funding and supporting a club. So universities could potentially underwrite DAO memberships for scholars to participate in a club. But again, what you're describing there is not an open access, you're not describing a public good. You're not describing everyone can join this. You're describing a club with membership that is then supported. We can think around university infrastructures doing mining on these things. That could be a licensed operation. But this opens up new types of business models for thinking about, once you see them clearly as clubs. It also understands the way in which value will move inside a club. Authors don't need to be supported on this, but you definitely need to have some mechanism for keeping track of who's contributing what to the club. And again, that's just a administrative registry keeping track of who contributed what when, and maybe we can tokenize those things. We can provide tokenized bounties on and so on. But there's the notion that what blockchain technology brings us is not what the internet brought us, the internet communications technology. Blockchain coordinating infrastructure, ideally for self-organizing groups. Perfect, right? That's what we've been looking for all along. All right, so that's sort of the point out we wanted to make. This is discussed at some length speculatively, and again, we wrote all this back in 2014, so it was before we'd really sort of seen the implications of where this is going. But everything we've seen since then indicates that that underlying economic model was fundamentally correct. Now it's just the question is what specific technologies will we pull into that space? But the argument here is that when we're thinking of this, we're not trying to describe a universal communications infrastructure, dissemination of knowledge that's otherwise produced. What we're trying to describe is a production technology where a group of people come together and create governance infrastructure and tools and mechanisms to collectively explore ideas as a group. All right, so that's sort of how we see this. The implication there is that journals have always been clubs. We just haven't really had effective institutional technology to deliver that as a single platform. We've always had it separated out into universities and schools and blockchain technology comes along and potentially for the first time in hundreds of years actually provides an integrated technology for this. And I think that's the reason to think of this from a revolutionary perspective, not an evolutionary perspective. Finish there. Thank you. Questions?
I think that's brilliant. If we then think, clubs, I think historically they came from London. It's gentlemen's clubs, right?
Yeah.
And a part of it is also very much the face-to-face, the regular face-to-face. So is a part of a club also that you need at least an annual meeting somewhere so that you can get people together? That goes beyond the blockchain, but is that an important part of the essence of a club?
Well, I think this is the question we need to look into. We know that this is a thing. Scholarly conferences, as expensive as they are to organize and time-consuming, are an essential part of it. The question is what's going on there. Is this largely about just people learning information from other people, because there's way cheaper ways you can do that? Or is it a kind of trust and verification? You need to check out that they are, is what is being provided by that face-to-face group meeting actual trust verification rather than information communication? So, my hypothesis or guess would be that it's actually far more about trust, the trust side of it, than.
I think that this weekend is probably a great experiment in your question, because this is the creation of a knowledge club right here and now.
Yeah.
For a journal.
Yeah.
Generation of trust, yes. But face-to-face is probably the mechanism that creates most trust.
Yeah.
That's the way we're hardwired, right?
Well, my theory on this is that the reason it does is it's costly. And because it's a costly signal that you've done. I've put in the effort to come and meet you face-to-face. And so it's not only can I verify who you are and so on, it's that I know that you're committed because you've incurred a cost to do so. And in that sense, the more expensive and further you have to travel to get to a conference, the more important it is that you go.
I hope that's wrong. I hope that's wrong, because that's deeply exclusionary, particularly for people in the South.
I have a question in the back here. If you're thinking about club formation, then there are certain models where it's not necessarily optimal to have homogeneous clubs, right? You want different skills in the production potentially. And so if you're thinking about interdisciplinary productivity, it strikes me that somebody who has the specialized skill of being able to integrate might be the kind of person who would travel from club to club, journal to journal, instead of everybody trying to be in the same club or something. So.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you've just redefined the editorial role rather than as a quality gatekeeper, but as a network maker function. So clubs would definitely an effective sort of scholarly ecology of clubs would require that role, and that role is not there'll be certain prestige aspects to it and sort of just broad knowledge aspects to it that current editors have, but it is a group making skill not,
Well, at a technical level, it's also just an interoperability between journals and the token model, I suppose. I mean, one thing that strikes me in all of this coming from the humanities is how poorly the citation system also works already. In a lot of the fields that I publish in, because I wouldn't say I publish in one particular field, if you have a lot of citations, it doesn't mean that your work is liked. We often cite people because we disagree with them. So, I'm also interested in ways you might be able to build that kind of nuance into these systems.
So this is just a response to your previous comment regarding sort of trust, and I think maybe the value of coming to there's other ways. I think there's an idea that coming face to face is about demonstrating that you're providing resources. I mean, there are other ways you could do that. For example, writing a paper together, but then how do you write the paper together if you don't know the person? I mean, I think it's about like, maybe that's part of establishing trust, is that you just sort of able to, in other words, I think it's hard to get going on a collaboration if you don't, it's about the initializing collaboration should be done in person, but once you sort of have a foothold, then you can more easily, I think, work remotely. So I don't know, this more of an observation than a question, but anyway.
Hey, Jason, a question. To what extent is the problem we are talking about now here of creating these new forms of communication something that actually has been solved about like 30 years ago with the web and has emerged there in other forms like commons-based peer production, and it's just an activism and an appendix that we are carrying these journals forward in a way, and now we can disrupt it?
Yeah, so I mean, like in a sense, I mean, one aspect of this is and this is there are actually sort of a number of significant costs associated with the proofing and writing and organizing and coordinating and so on. So there is still a sort of producer side role in this. But I think we haven't really been. What's been missing is this ability to actually build this type of club infrastructure, and this is very, very new. Like we haven't. I don't think we've tested this yet. Right, so we've had a good 30 years of testing the implications of what happens when the costs of communications fall dramatically. And we saw, open access is definitely possible, and it gave a huge explosion in preprints. That was definitely a thing that was made possible by that. So the communication aspects did, but not necessarily scholarly production. And I think that's the dawn we're at, is the explorations of what we can do with that. I'm enormously optimistic. I think this will be revolutionary for these reasons.
There's something unspoken as well in all of this, which is that maybe it's not about technology, maybe it's just about universities and how we have created really terrible systems, and the means of promotion and tenure and the rest of it are deeply unfair and wrong. And is there a way through taking back some of the ways that we work with each other and how we authenticate each other's work that might start to just improve some of the problems of universities these days as they become more based on metrics and the rest, terrible working environments.
I think we don't have any time for more questions, so let's thank Jason
All right,
one more time.
thank you.